Imagine a death so foul, so meticulously engineered for maximum suffering that it makes a simple beheading look like a gentle mercy. Imagine being rendered completely immobile, trapped within a hollowed-out space that becomes both your prison and your coffin. Now, imagine being force-fed, compelled to consume rich, sweet substances not for nourishment, but to transform your own body into an instrument of your destruction. You are then left out under a blistering sun, smeared with honey, a helpless offering to every stinging, biting, burrowing insect in the vicinity. They come first for the honey on your skin, but soon they discover the filth your own body is producing. They lay their eggs, their larvae hatch, and then they begin to eat you. Not from the outside in, but from the inside out, burrowing through your intestines, your organs, your flesh, while you are still alive, still conscious, for days, perhaps even weeks. This is not the fever dream of a madman. This was a method of execution recorded by the ancients, known as Scaphism, or the boats. It represents a pinnacle of human cruelty, a punishment so grotesque it seems to defy belief. What could a person possibly do to be condemned to such a fate, to have their life end not with a bang or even a whimper, but with the sickening, protracted hum of their own consumption? To understand the horror of Scaphism, we must first understand the world that conceived it. We journey back to the Achaemenid Empire of Persia in the year 401 before Common Era. The empire is a sprawling behemoth, stretching from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River, a tapestry of dozens of cultures, languages, and peoples held together by the absolute authority of one man, the King of Kings, Artaxerxes II. In this world, the king is not merely a ruler, he is the embodiment of the state, a figure semi-divine, the sole arbiter of justice, glory, and truth. His word is law. His honor is paramount, and his narrative of events is the only one that matters. To challenge that narrative, even inadvertently, is to challenge the very foundation of the empire. It is an act of treason more insidious than open rebellion, for it attacks the king's legitimacy, the very source of his power, and for such a crime, the punishment must be more than death. It must be an annihilation of the self, a public lesson in the consequences of stealing a king's glory. Please consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. It truly helps us build our community of curious minds. Friends, please help us get our first 1,000 subscribers. Now let's explore the system that demanded such a brutal price for a moment of foolish pride. Our story centers on a man named Mithridates. He was not a prince, nor a great general, but a young, competent soldier in the army of King Artaxerxes. He was, by all accounts, a loyal man, prepared to fight and die for his king, and he would soon have his chance. A shadow loomed over the empire, a threat that came not from a foreign power, but from within the royal family itself. Cyrus the Younger, the king's ambitious and charismatic brother, had decided the throne belonged to him. Having gathered a formidable army, including a famous contingent of 10,000 Greek mercenaries, Cyrus marched from his satrapy in Anatolia deep into the heart of the empire, intent on deposing his brother. The two forces, two brothers vying for the ultimate prize, were destined to meet on a dusty plain near a village called Cunaxa, not far from Babylon. This was to be the battle that would decide the fate of Persia, a clash of titans where loyalties would be tested and legacies forged in blood. Mithridates was there, a small cog in the vast war machine of the king, ready to play his part in the grand, violent spectacle. The Battle of Cunaxa was a chaotic and brutal affair. The dust kicked up by tens of thousands of soldiers and horses choked the air, turning the sky a hazy, hellish orange. The noise was a deafening symphony of clashing metal, guttural war cries, and the screams of the wounded and dying. In the heart of the fray, the two brothers sought each other out. Cyrus, bold and perhaps reckless, spotted Artaxerxes' royal entourage. With a cry of, "I see the man," he charged headlong toward his brother, cutting a bloody path through the king's elite bodyguards. He managed to get close, hurling a javelin that wounded Artaxerxes in the chest, knocking him from his horse. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as though the rebel prince might succeed. But the king's guards swarmed Cyrus, overwhelming him. In the swirling chaos of this desperate personal struggle, a javelin flew from an unexpected quarter. It was thrown by the young soldier, Mithridates, who, seeing the king's brother in the melee, acted on instinct. His aim was true. The javelin struck Cyrus in the temple, just near his eye. He stumbled, dazed and bleeding profusely, and fell from his horse. Another, lesser-known courtier then finished the wounded prince. The rebellion was over. Cyrus the Younger was dead. Victory belonged to King Artaxerxes. The official narrative was immediately set in stone. The king, wounded but valiant, had personally slain his treacherous brother in single combat, securing his throne through his own strength and divine favor. This was the story that would be etched into the annals of the empire. This was the truth, because the king decreed it so. Mithridates, the soldier whose javelin had arguably turned the tide, was rewarded handsomely for his role. He was showered with gold, fine robes and honors, all for being a part of the king's glorious victory. But here, the treacherous seeds of his downfall were sown. The king had been generous, but he had also been clear. The ultimate glory for Cyrus's death was his and his alone. The system of absolute monarchy required this. The king could not be seen as having been saved by a common soldier. His power rested on the perception of his own martial prowess and divine right. For a time, Mithridates understood his place. He was a celebrated hero, but a supporting one, an instrument of the king's will. The fatal error, the moment that sealed his horrific fate, came not on the battlefield, but at a banquet table. Flush with his newfound wealth and status, and perhaps with too much wine in his belly, Mithridates' vanity got the better of him. In the company of the king's eunuchs and other courtiers, he began to boast. He spoke of the battle, of the chaos, of the decisive moment. He let slip the truth. As the Greek historian Plutarch, our primary source for this tale, recounts, Mithridates, foolishly drunken with wine, declared to the assembled guests, "In truth, it was I, and no other, who killed Cyrus. What a toss of a javelin that was!" He spoke of how his weapon had struck the prince near the eye, and how that blow had brought the great rebel down. He was not trying to start another rebellion. He was not plotting treason. He was simply a man, his judgment clouded by alcohol and pride, trying to claim what he felt was his rightful glory, a momentary indiscretion in a private gathering. But in the court of an absolute monarch, there are no private gatherings, there are no secrets. His words, meant to elevate his own status, were a direct contradiction of the king's official history. They were an act of theft, stealing the one thing Artaxerxes could not afford to lose, his personal legend. Word of Mithridates' boast traveled with sickening speed through the gilded corridors of the palace, eventually reaching the ears of the one man he should never have crossed, King Artaxerxes himself. The king was enraged. This was not just an insult, it was a fundamental challenge to his authority. If a common soldier could claim credit for the most significant act of his reign, what other parts of his divinely ordained power could be questioned? The narrative had to be protected at all costs. The king's fury was further stoked by another powerful figure in the court, his mother, the queen dowager Parysatis. Parysatis had secretly favored her younger son, Cyrus, and harbored a deep, simmering hatred for all those she held responsible for his death. While she despised Artaxerxes' inner circle, she despised Mithridates even more, for it was his hand that had ultimately struck down her beloved son. She whispered poison into the king's ear, demanding a punishment that would not only silence the boastful soldier, but also serve as a terrifying example to any who might dare to revise the king's history. Artaxerxes, caught between his own wounded pride and his mother's vengeful machinations, condemned Mithridates. The sentence was not a quick, clean death by the sword, the honorable end for a soldier. The king decreed something far worse. He sentenced Mithridates to Scaphism. He was to be given the boats. The day of the punishment arrived, a day that would stretch into an eternity of torment. The executioners, men whose own humanity must have been eroded by their grim profession, located two small, narrow boats. These were not grand vessels, but simple skiffs, perhaps more like hollowed-out tree trunks, chosen specifically because they were roughly the same size as a man's body. They laid Mithridates down in one of the boats, his body fitting snugly within its confines. He was now a man in a wooden shell. Then they took the second boat and placed it upside down on top of the first, creating a grotesque, makeshift coffin. They fastened the two halves together securely, creating a sealed container from which there was no escape, but they did not seal it completely. Crucial openings were left, small gaps through which the condemned man's head, hands, and feet protruded. He was now entombed, yet still connected to the outside world, a prisoner within a vessel that would become his personal hell. He could see the sky, he could feel the air on his face. He could move his fingers and toes. These small vestiges of freedom were not an act of mercy. They were an essential component of the torture to come. The first stage of the methodical deconstruction of his body and spirit began. This was the part that was so diabolically unique to Scaphism. His captors brought forth bowls of milk and honey, a mixture that in any other context might symbolize life, sweetness, and sustenance. But here it was poison. They ordered Mithridates to eat and drink. When he refused, understanding instinctively that this was part of his punishment, they employed a brutal form of persuasion. They pricked his eyes with sharp implements, goading him with pain until he had no choice but to comply, to open his mouth and swallow the cloying liquid to make the immediate agony stop. They forced him to consume vast quantities. Imagine the psychological torment of this act. You are being compelled to ingest the very fuel for your own protracted and disgusting demise. Every swallow is an act of self-destruction, a participation in your own unmaking. Your body's natural instinct for survival, the urge to eat and drink, is perverted into the engine of your suffering. It is a chilling violation of the most basic biological imperatives, a true masterpiece of psychological warfare waged upon a single, helpless individual. Once he was filled to bursting with the milk and honey, the next phase commenced. The executioners took more honey, thick and viscous, and began to smear it liberally over all his exposed parts. His face was coated in a sticky, sweet mask. His hands and feet, which he could not retract, were painted with the substance. He was now, quite literally, human bait. They carried the boat coffin, with its living, breathing occupant, to a location chosen for its foulness, a stagnant pond or a sun-drenched, marshy swamp, a place teeming with life, but not the kind of life one would ever wish to encounter. There, they left him, anchored in the fetid water, exposed to the elements. His ordeal truly began. The sun was a relentless tormentor, beating down on his honey-covered face, a heat from which he could not shield himself. And then they came. At first, it was just a few. A fly, attracted by the overwhelming sweetness, landed on his cheek. He could not swat it away. Then another and another. Soon, his face was a crawling, buzzing mass of insects. Wasps and horseflies arrived, their stings sharp and fiery against his skin. Every exposed inch of him became a feeding ground, and all he could do was watch, feel, and listen to the incessant hum of his tormentors. This external assault was merely the prelude to the true, unspeakable horror of Scaphism, which was designed to attack the body from within. The massive quantities of milk and honey he had been forced to consume began to wreak havoc on his digestive system. A violent, uncontrollable, and unending bout of diarrhea began. Trapped inside the suffocating, dark confines of the boats, Mithridates was now lying in a pool of his own liquefying excrement. The enclosed space became a septic tank, a humid, sweltering incubator of filth. The stench, unimaginable to us, was his entire world. He breathed it, tasted it, lived in it. And this putrefying morass, leaking from the seams of the boats into the stagnant water, sent out a new, more potent invitation. It was no longer just the superficial sweetness of honey that drew the creatures of the swamp. It was the deep, primal smell of decay and waste. This attracted a new and far more horrifying class of vermin. This is the part of the process that tests the limits of our imagination and our fortitude. The insects that now arrived were not content to feast on the surface. They were drawn to the source of the filth. They crawled into the openings of the boat, entering the warm, dark, putrid space where Mithridates lay. They began to breed in his excrement. Eggs were laid by the thousands. Within a day or two, these eggs hatched, and now his prison was teeming with a new generation of life. Maggots, grubs, and worms, all writhing in the waste that surrounded him. But there was not enough for them there. They sought richer nourishment, and so they turned to the only source available, the living body of Mithridates himself. They began to burrow into his flesh. They entered his body through his anus, through any sores or wounds that had developed, consuming him slowly, meticulously, from the inside out. He could feel them. A constant, squirming, gnawing sensation deep within his gut, in his limbs, under his skin. It was a living infestation, a private, internal agony for which there are no adequate words. He was being hollowed out, eaten alive by the progeny of his own bodily functions. Perhaps the most sadistic element of this entire ordeal was its calculated longevity. This was not a punishment designed to be over in a few hours. The king did not just want Mithridates dead. He wanted him to suffer for as long as humanly possible. To that end, the executioners returned every single day. They would approach the floating coffin, ignoring the horrific stench and the cloud of insects, and they would repeat the first step of the torture. They would once again force-feed him milk and honey. This daily ritual had a dual purpose. First, it ensured he would not die quickly from dehydration or starvation. It kept his body just alive enough to continue suffering. Second, it created a continuous supply of fresh waste, ensuring that the colony of vermin eating him alive would continue to thrive and multiply. Every day was a renewal of the horror. Every sunrise brought not hope, but the promise of more forced feeding, more filth, and the continuation of his own consumption. Can you imagine his state of mind? The moments of delirium, the fever dreams, punctuated by the horrifying, lucid realization of his situation. He was a living ecosystem of decay, a feast for 1 billion tiny mouths, kept alive only to prolong the banquet. According to Plutarch's account, this nightmare did not last for a day or 2 days. Mithridates endured this state for 17 days, 17 sunrises, 17 force feedings. Over 2 weeks of being consciously devoured. Think of what that means: the slow creep of gangrene in his limbs, the septicemia coursing through his blood, the constant, maddening pain, not just from the insects, but from the pressure sores, the infections, the sun blistering his face. His eyes, which his executioners had once pricked to force him to eat, were likely the first things the flies consumed. He would have been blind long before the end, left alone in the buzzing, crawling darkness of his tomb. The line between life and death would have blurred into a meaningless distinction. Was he a man anymore, or just a vessel? A consciousness trapped in a rotting shell, waiting for the moment when the gnawing would finally reach his heart or his brain and grant him the mercy of oblivion. The inhumanity is staggering. It is a punishment that seems to concern itself with the very definition of being alive, stretching that definition to its most agonizing and grotesque extreme. On the 17th day, it was presumed the sentence was finally complete. Officials, likely holding perfumed cloths over their noses, were dispatched to confirm the death and retrieve the body. The 2 halves of the boat were pried apart. The sight and smell that greeted them must have been apocalyptic. Plutarch describes it with chilling brevity. He says the man's flesh was devoured, and swarms of vermin were preying on what was left and were attached to his inwards. The initial opening would have released a dense cloud of flies and other creatures that had been breeding inside. The corpse itself would have been barely recognizable as human. It was a hollowed-out husk, a writhing mass of maggots and worms, the bones visible in places where the flesh had been stripped clean. The sickly, sweet smell of decay, mingled with honey and excrement, would have been powerful enough to make even the most hardened soldier retch. Mithridates, the proud soldier who boasted of his battlefield prowess, was reduced to a putrid, insect-ridden remnant, his final indignity being the horrific state of his own remains. There was no glory here, no honor, only filth and revulsion. This was the ultimate victory for Artaxerxes. He had not just killed the man, he had obliterated the very idea of him, transforming him into a monument of abjection. So why this particular method? Why go to such elaborate, theatrical, and resource-intensive lengths to kill one boastful soldier? The answer lies in the symbolic nature of the punishment. Scaphism was not merely about causing pain, it was a carefully constructed piece of political theater designed to communicate a message about power. A soldier's greatest ambition is often to die an honorable death in battle and be remembered for his courage. Mithridates had sought to claim exactly that. The king, in his rage, engineered the most dishonorable death imaginable. Instead of a swift death by a clean blade, Mithridates was subjected to a slow, foul, passive end. He did not die fighting, he died rotting. Instead of being remembered for his strength, his body was made into a spectacle of filth and weakness. The use of milk and honey was a particularly cruel piece of irony, using symbols of life and celebration to facilitate a disgusting death. It was a message to everyone in the empire: your glory, your honor, your very identity is a gift from the king. He bestows it, and he can retract it in the most demeaning way possible. He can take a hero and turn him into a swarm's nest. Your body is not your own. Your story is not your own. Everything belongs to the king. The systemic cruelty did not end with Mithridates. The web of vengeance spun by the queen mother, Artaxerxes, demanded more victims. She had not forgotten her hatred for those who had participated in the official narrative of her son Cyrus's death, a narrative she knew to be a lie constructed by the king's inner circle. She targeted the man who had delivered Cyrus's head and hand to Artaxerxes, a courtier named Mithridates. Using her influence, she won him from the king in a game of dice. Once he was in her power, she had him flayed alive. His skin was then stretched out on display, a gruesome testament to her unending grief and ruthlessness. She also went after the executioners who had carried out the king's sentence on Mithridates. She believed they had been too merciful, or perhaps simply hated them for being instruments of a court she despised. The chief executioner was condemned to a similar, horrifying fate. This cycle of retribution demonstrates the deep sickness within the system. The initial act of cruelty against Mithridates was not a contained event. It was a symptom of a political structure built on absolute power, paranoia, and personal vengeance, where human life was a disposable commodity in the games of thrones played by the elite. It is, of course, important to approach this account with a degree of scholarly caution. Our main source is Plutarch, a Greek writing in the Roman era, centuries after the events took place. He was a biographer and a moralist, not a modern historian. He may have exaggerated the details of Scaphism to create a more dramatic and horrifying story, to highlight the barbarism of the Persians in contrast to Greek or Roman virtues. Some historians have questioned whether Scaphism was a standard, legally codified punishment or a singular, apocryphal act of cruelty invented for one specific man. There is very little corroborating evidence from Persian sources themselves, but in a way, its literal truth is secondary to its symbolic power. Whether it happened exactly as described or not, the story of Mithridates and the boat survived because it resonated so powerfully. It is a perfect parable about the fragility of honor, the bottomless nature of human cruelty, and the terrifying consequences of speaking an inconvenient truth to absolute power. The story persists not because we can prove every gruesome detail, but because we recognize the dark human impulses it so vividly portrays. We began with a question: what had this man done to deserve such a fate? The answer is both simple and profoundly unsettling. He did not betray his country. He did not murder or steal. His crime was a crime of language. He tried to claim ownership of his own story. In a moment of drunken vanity, he challenged the official narrative, and for that, the system decreed that his body, his life, and his legacy must be rendered into filth. He stole the king's glory, so the king stole his humanity. This ancient, gruesome tale of boats, milk, and honey feels distant, a horror from a barbaric age we have long since left behind. But have we? The technology of public shaming has evolved, but the fundamental impulse remains disturbingly familiar. We no longer use physical boats and insects to destroy a person, but the digital world has provided us with a new, equally effective arsenal. Today, a person can make a single misstepper foolish comment, an ill-advised joke, a momentary lapse in judgment, and have it broadcast to the world in an instant. The swarm that descends is not made of flies and wasps, but of anonymous accounts, of furious comments, of digital dog piles that pick apart a person's reputation with a relentless, gnawing efficiency. Careers are destroyed, lives are upended, and the individual is left exposed and helpless, their identity redefined by their worst moment. They are, in a metaphorical sense, trapped in a kind of digital scaphism, force-fed their own mistake over and over, while a faceless crowd consumes their reputation. The goal, just as it was for Artaxerxes, is not merely to punish, but to annihilate, to turn a person into a public lesson, a monument of shame. The story of Mithridates is a chilling reminder that while the methods may change, the dark capacity for systemic, public, and disproportionate cruelty is a permanent part of the human condition. It cautions us to recognize that the line between justice and vengeance, between accountability and annihilation, is perilously thin, and that the desire to control the narrative can lead to the most monstrous of outcomes.